Need a zombie look with some 3D wounds? I got you. For the wounds, I'm gonna be using this wax, Mehron Extra Flush. If you're not familiar with this wax, the nice thing is you do not have to warm it up with your hands before working with it. And also there's these little fibers within the wax that help to create weird texture. And because it's so soft, it's really easy to build up some wounds. Also used a little bit of this to smooth my brows down, just going around and adding it all over. This stuff is really fun to work with, and it blends into the skin effortlessly. Once you got all the ones you want, you're gonna need to seal them. I'm gonna do this with some latex. Now, this wax does not harden, so when you're sealing, just be careful not to push too hard because you don't wanna destroy all that stuff you just created. Let dry, and now for paint. I'm gonna do an easy rotten textured skin, starting with the sea sponge and gray. Now you want this to be blotchy, so you don't want the sponge to be too sopping wet. The drier the sponge, the more of that fine texture you're gonna get. And you can also go along with a spatter brush or a cut chip brush and spatter just a little more texture if you want. But you can skip this step if you want. It just adds a different type of texture. Using a torn makeup sponge, we're gonna start to create a clustery vein effect. So you'll want to use reds, blues, or purples. Stamping heavier in the contour areas and making sure that the makeup is pretty dry doing the center of the face because I just want a light texture. Now you should be looking pretty crazy. Shading is really what's gonna give you that dry, emaciated look. I'm going in with black, but if you want something a little more subtle, you can go in with a brown or a gray. And this is just gonna be all of those typical contour areas. Temples, under the cheeks, jawline. You want the skin to look like it's sinking back onto the skull. So if you press your face, those squishier areas, that's where you're gonna be shading. The areas where you feel more bone, those are your highlight points. Really want to sink those eye sockets in. Using a thinner brush, you can kind of carve the edges of the shading, and this is going to give it a more drastic shaded effect. Also made these sort of loops in the fronts of the cheek, so it starts to give the skin a look like it's pulling down on that cheekbone. And you also notice that I bounce around a lot when I'm doing this. That's because I don't want to go in and say, just work on the eyes, and it comes out super dark, and now I have to commit to that darkness all over. If you want some of those shaded areas to look sharper, you can go in with a little bit of a highlight along that dark edge. Painted the wounds with some red and a touch of black. With a new torn makeup sponge, stamp some white over the wounds just to make them pop. A little on the brow, nose bridge, and cheeks too. Now really start to darken the eyes. Added some brown lines to create some skin wrinkles. Sharpen some of the black areas a little more so it looks more like the edge of the bone sitting under the skin. Okay, veins. Going to do veining using yarn. Just pull it apart, add some glue, and start adding bends and curves with a tool. You can pull it apart further and create more branching. I do have a more in-depth video on this technique. I'll leave a link in the description. And yes, campaigning veins would be quicker, but I just really like the dynamic veins this method creates, even if that means cleanup is a little longer because now you've put glue all over the place. But you do you, because painted veins will look great too. Now, if you use glue, make sure you powder everything so you're not sticky, and then just spray some sealer to get rid of any powdery look. Lenses for a little more creep, brown mouth dye by SFX. Now you could go in with blood or goop and just have fun. It's a zombie. So we talked about 2 different methods to create veins, but what about glow in the dark ones? Click the next video to see how you can create a glowing radioactive makeup look.